The most successful coaches never stop learning. They are committed to their personal growth and making themselves better. I'm Colby Donovan, and welcome to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. I'll speak with the world's most respected coaches, best-selling authors, and top business leaders to give you insight into their philosophies, lessons, and mindsets for you to apply to your own life. Head on over to coachingcoaches.co, where you can subscribe to this podcast and join some of the top coaches around the country who also enjoy our regular newsletter. My guest today is Daniel Coyle, best-selling author of The Talent Code, The Culture Code, and, as of 2 days ago, The Culture Playbook, 60 highly effective actions to help your group succeed. When I started this podcast 2 years ago, Daniel is one of the people on my bucket list to be able to talk to, so this is a treat for me. We talk about insights he's learned about how to build a strong culture, what some best practices are around hiring and team building, and what he's learned from consulting with the Cleveland Guardians. My co-host today is once again Oliver Winterbone, Director of Coaches and Executives at Wasserman, one of the premier talent management companies in the world. The Athletic recently named him to their NBA 40 under 40 list. And one more thing before we get to the episode. If this is your first time listening to the show, press that subscribe button so you don't miss another episode. And if you're already subscribed, think of one person in your life who would enjoy this or any other episode so far and shoot it over to them. With that, please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Coyle. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Colby. It's good to be here with you.
Big day for you.
It is. This is opening day, right? I mean, what do they say about rookies on opening day? Like in baseball, they always talk about you can't feel your legs. I don't know. Maybe that's how I feel today, but we'll see. It's kind of fun to have it out there in the world.
Yeah, you can't feel your hands from writing it. So we're going to get into all things about the book today, but I got to say, until reading this book, I didn't know something about you, which I've been a fan of yours for years, and now I'm like 40 times more of a fan. How do you go from writing a book that leads to the movie Hardball to then going all in on the Talent Code and the Culture Code?
That's kind of weird, isn't it? Like life is big, life is long. I kind of bumped into this story when I was a young editor in Chicago. I love baseball, and I was a volunteer coach at a place called Cabrini Green, which was at the time the most violent housing project in America. And the LA riots happened, and I ended up sort of writing a story about a season in the life, and that story came out in '94, and then got turned into a movie subsequently. And the lingo, some things that have come out of it, it's been fun to think, like, we go into the ship, like that chant they do in the movie. I don't know if this is very obscure, but there's a chant that the players do in the movie. We're going to the ship. And that is like now in kind of in the oxygen, you hear kids yell it, you hear college kids yell it. That's kind of funny, but I guess at the root of all of it are a couple things. A deep love of sport, and maybe it comes from being born with brothers on each side of me by a few months, but the real curiosity about what it takes to be successful, and real curiosity to kind of x-ray performance to see what it's made of. And when I was, I guess there's a little bit of a thread that connects those two, because they're both kind of built around the same challenge, whether it's a bunch of kids on a little league team or you're talking about, the best athletes on the planet.
So you released the Culture Code 4 or 5 years ago?
Culture Code was 2018. Yep, about 4 years ago. Yep.
And so why release the playbook today?
Well, there was kind of this call after the Culture Code. It's a book that's got a lot of story, it's got a lot of theory, it's got a lot of science, and there's a certain reader, and I suspect it's the majority of readers, that are like, yeah, give me the takeaways. Like, tell me what to do. Tell me what I should do. Give me the recipe book. Give me the blueprints. And also, the second factor was, subsequent to that coming out, of course, we lived through this pandemic that completely reorganized the way we communicated, how we brought emotion to work. There were issues of social justice, issues of technology. So culture was sort of morphing and changing, and the skill set that it takes seemed like a really super interesting thing to dive into at this moment today. So those things kind of combined. And as I wrote it, I realized I couldn't just deliver the takeaways. There's no such thing. Culture is not something you can paint by the numbers on. And so to make it work, it evolved into more of a workbook. It evolved into more of a thing with some reflective questions in it that make people stop and say, oh, what do we look like at our best? Like, let's explore that question together. What do we look like at our best? Second question, what stops us from being our best? Let's define that. And so these questions end up being dropped in, and there's little pages in the book that say your turn on them. And so the book becomes more of a conversation, a tool to hopefully create conversation within groups, within teams, within organizations to help them get better together. Because culture is not something you can just sort of import. It's not something you can wave a wand. It takes conversation, time, reflection, and working together. That's the kind of tough news, if you want to call it that. The good news is that you have way more control of it than you might think. And that the actions you take have immediate impact in how you get along with each other. And when you tune in to kind of the deep human grammar behind this stuff, like how do we create safety and connection? How do we build trust? How do we figure out where we're going? How do we create this windshield of purpose? It all becomes really accessible and really possible to do.
From my standpoint, a lot of my clients, a lot of the people I work with, if they're assistant coaches and they're taking over a head coaching job, really there's two ways you get one of these. Someone leaves and goes and gets a better job, so the program they're leaving is in usually good shape, or someone was fired and you're taking over really a toxic environment. What advice would you give to someone who's maybe been an assistant coach that is now stepping in as a head coach for the first time and really kind of has to set the foundation for a cultural change in the organization they're taking over?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but I guess the first thing I would say is you gotta build a foundation of safety. The good coaches that take over, Steve Kerr did this, Kevin Stefanski did this on the Browns. Take time early on to have individual conversations with everybody, right? The best person at doing this, I think, was Coach Pop. When they signed, before they even signed Tim Duncan, they were thinking of taking him in the first round. And Coach Pop was a brand new coach who had come on in a very toxic losing environment. He flew out to the U.S. Virgin Islands and spent like 3 days with Tim Duncan, and they never talked about basketball. Like, imagine that, right? Imagine that. They talked about island life and food and wine and all politics and all sorts of things to form that fundamental basis of human connection, because those good coaches realize that all of us walk around with this big question whirring in the back of our minds, which is, do I belong here? Is this safe? Like, do I share a future with these people? And that question, which is millions of years old and impossible to stop, because we always have it. It's a very useful question for our survival. It's helped us live this long, right? But great coaches realize, I need to diffuse that question. I need to over-communicate safety. I need to over-communicate belonging. I need to build a safe relationship with people first thing, because that's the platform on which everything else happens. If you come in and start talking about scheme and start talking about strategy and start talking about technique, that is absolutely lost. And good coaches have something, you hear it called feel, right? Where they're building that relationship over time. And then they're talking about mechanics or tactics or scheme. Another guy who was really good at that was another member of the San Antonio Spurs that I'm sure you guys know, Chip Engelland. When he was there, Kawhi Leonard was a top pick. Kawhi Leonard came in with some difficulty with his shot. He kind of shot from over his head, so it needed to be rebuilt. And Chip Engelland is the shooting coach. And so he waited. He had good feel. He waited and waited and waited. He coached him a little, got to know him. They talked about sneakers. Chip makes a big deal of knowing about sneakers. And so he has that as this vehicle of connection. And about a few months into the relationship, Chip Engelland says, hey, Kawhi, I'm going to ask you a question. You don't have to answer it today. Answer it tomorrow. Don't answer it today. And the question is, do you want to be good or do you want to be great? And Kawhi Leonard thought about it, came back the next day, said, I want to be great. And Chip said, okay, now we're going to start. Now we're going to do something different. Now I've created that relationship. I've created this North Star for us. Now I'm going to start coaching you for real. And we're going to take you there. And when you feel like bowing out, I'm going to remind you of this moment. I'm going to remind you. And that is what that skill is. And you can't do it paint by the numbers. But the people who do it are keenly focused on a couple things. They're focused on the relationship. They're focused on safety and building trust. And they're focused on creating a really clear North Star.
So if you're someone like Pop or Chip, for example, let's say one day Chip wants to lead his own program, what are some of the things that people in those assistant coach or assistant GM or like if you're not the top dog, what are some of the things that you can do to prepare yourself for that opportunity when that situation arises?
Yeah, I think a few things come to mind there. Study the people who do it the best. Take your time and look. You're not the first person to make this transition. When you posed this, I thought immediately of Kevin Stefanski coming into the Browns during COVID. He was hired during COVID, and he did all these sorts of weird little experiments to try to get the team to come together. One of them was the 4 H's, because they couldn't be together for real life. They were just doing these Zoom calls. He's trying to create team chemistry, trying to connect. The 4 H's is an idea he got from VCU basketball, where you get together and you talk about your history, your hope, your heartache, and your hero. And it creates this really vulnerable exchange, which of course builds trust. We talk about that a lot, the vulnerability loop. But it creates this extraordinary exchange where people all of a sudden start talking about their grandparents and their parents and their best friends and their history and their hope and their heartbreak. And he did a bunch of these little experiments, and it kind of worked. The reason he was able to do that is that he was talking to somebody at VCU basketball, and they were talking about how am I going to do this? How am I going to create connection? And this VCU basketball coach sort of shared this idea back, and he had the guts to take it and use it and see if it worked and refine it and use it over and over again with small groups until it really built a heck of a lot of chemistry. And the Browns, of course, ended up going to the playoffs that first year, partly based on those sorts of connections. So I think being a student of this, realizing you can't just sort of lean back on your natural charisma and figure it's going to happen. There's a thing here. And studying people who did it. The second thing I would say is capture your own reflections continually. As you study these people, as you try things to build culture around you, keep track of stuff that works. Keep track. You're like in a lab, sort of, is the way to think of it. And you're trying these experiments, and some of them work and some of them don't. Maybe when you try the Kawhi Leonard question with somebody, it doesn't quite work as well. Maybe you refine it in some way. Maybe when you try the 4-H exercise, it doesn't work. You should probably use 3 H's or use something else. There's no like magic thing here. So continue to sort of go to the edge of what you can do, test it out, and create conversations. I mean, that's the big thing. I think the big mistake that a lot of young leaders make is they think that being a leader is like being the captain of a ship. Like, you have to be the one with the power. You have to be the one with the knowledge. You have to tell people what to do. Now, that model of coaching is sort of from our history. We all grew up with that, right? That model of that person is the coach who always knows, who always tells us, and we just have to be obedient to that coach and we will win, right? That model doesn't work that well today. Because there's too much information. There's too much ownership and an agency among players. They're not looking to just be compliant. They want to get better. They want to have their own lives. So the best coaches you see today are people, I would say, like Steve Kerr. And the question that goes through Steve Kerr's mind, I think, all the time isn't, how do I be a great leader? It's, how can I be a great teammate? It's a really different question. I think Steve Kerr, if you really look at what he does, he functions like a great teammate. He's always looking to find people to elevate their voices. On the night before, I think it was the first national championship, they were having trouble with their defense against LeBron and the Cavs. And a video guy, like a video intern, basically came up with an idea that Kerr ended up using in the game. And it worked. And they go on to win, not just because of that, but it was a factor. And this idea that he created an environment where a video intern felt comfortable on the night before game 7, game 6, raising their hand and saying, hey, I have something to share. That's being a great teammate. Have you seen those videos where he puts his arm around Curry and talks to him during the game?
Sure.
I mean, they're incredible, right? What does he say to Curry? He's saying, "God, I wish I had your skill. If I went 3 for 4, that was a good night for me. You've missed," he goes, like, "you've missed 6 shots in a row and you keep putting it up. That's what makes you good. That's what makes you good." He's not Bobby Knighting the guy. He's not, being, an old-fashioned authoritarian coach. He's being a great teammate. And so this idea and what does it take to be a great teammate? Well, you gotta kind of meet people where they're at. You've got to listen to them. You've got to let them kind of co-create and grab that steering wheel with you. And that doesn't mean like tactically or mechanically or anything like that, but it means you have to create an environment where people feel like they have a voice. And that's ultimately what safety is all about. Building safety, that platform of safety, is about giving people voice.
It's interesting. So some of the words that you use in describing this, meet and listen and co-create. So a lot of those in the past would be in-person interactions. And when you wrote Culture Code, the idea of COVID and a pandemic and shutdowns, like, it was completely foreign to everybody. How much have you seen culture growth implementation? How much have you seen the landscape shift in the approach? And I know in some of the tips in your book, you talk about hybrid tips where you may be able to do this over Zoom or through a different method. How much change have you seen in how the genesis of culture takes place in environments?
A ton. I mean, it's like, I would describe it as like the core is the same, but there's this layer of experimentation going around on the outside of that core. The core is that it's really hard to have a really deep, real relationship unless you're in person some of the time. Like, we're not built to do it. You get so much more information when you're in person. You get so much more accuracy of perception when you're in person. So that core doesn't really shift, but around that, if you can be together sometimes, around that is this great landscape of experimentation that's happening on the video stuff, where you can realize, we're kind of better at making decisions as a group when we're separate, and we can all write down our ideas and share them on a document and not have the loudest one in the room dominate, and be more diverse. We can bring more voices into the room. That's a huge advantage that we maybe didn't have if we relied just in person. We can be a little more deliberative at times, rather than kind of when we're in person, we're just like racing and finish and with this urge to finish, and we can sort of slow our roll a little bit. So, and the other layer of experimentation that's kind of interesting is the way in which people are using video to kind of like find new ways of connecting. A cool book called Virtual Rituals by a guy named Glenn Fajardo, who works at Stanford's design school. And in it, he points out that, like, if you're going to be virtual, like, you can't just be virtual and sort of pretend you're still physical. Like, you actually have to be conscious of it and create kind of a space. And the best way to explain it, I guess, and I'm not doing a very good job explaining it, is you have to do something at the beginning of each meeting that kind of creates some sharing. He suggests, like, everybody biting a lemon at the same time, or playing certain music, or doing a set of exercises, or playing a little game, something that doesn't have to do with work, that creates kind of the shared participatory space. Now the meeting can go on, but taking that time to sort of take a second, let's connect, let's get real here, let's realize we're all together here, and let's create a moment, and then let's try to work together. And that to me is super interesting. And this whole, there's another company I bumped into recently that, they're totally virtual except for when they have a big problem, and then they have something they call a studio, and they kind of, it's like the bat signal, they blow the whistle, and everybody comes from around the country and meets in Omaha, and they have this intense, fun weekend in Omaha where they crank out all their problems, and they go back to their bat caves again. So it's all that we're living in this new era where these sorts of experiments are we're learning a lot from it.
If you enjoy this podcast, I also write a weekly newsletter sharing the best content I found in the last week that directly applies to coaches. Some of the best coaches in the world subscribe, and it's free. So go to coachingcoaches.substack.com or check out the link in the show notes to subscribe. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.substack.com. Let's get back to the episode. A couple ideas you talk about in the book that kind of relate to the idea of like a shared experience is the idea of symbols and just incessantly repeating like catchphrases, even if it's corny. And I love this. I love both ideas. I mean, when we were at Florida, I remember when Oliver and I were at Florida together, I remember Coach Donovan wanted the guys, this was the year we went to the Final Four, 2014, one of the guys to come up with like a slogan. And they went in the locker room for like 2 hours and came out and they said their slogan was swag. And we're all like, you absolute morons. And it actually stood for strengthen when adversity grows. And throughout the entire season, like we had bracelets and I mean, everyone talked about it all the time, but I mean, well, you'd like to think it actually made a difference and our guys really stuck to that. But why are those catchphrases and symbolic, either actual physical symbols or like symbolic ideas or whatever, so impactful on us and a company's culture?
Because they're navigational. Because they're navigational tools, and we are such distractible human beings, right? I mean, there's so many cool experiments that show just how distractible we are, right? You've probably seen the one where people are passing a basketball and you're supposed to count how many passes, and then a gorilla walks out and half the people miss the gorilla. You know, that's us, right? We miss that all the time. So we're hugely distractible. We need and crave some kind of a shared compass needle pointing us toward some destination. And it's not what the vision is, it's what the vision does, if that makes sense. You could have had swag, you could have had badass as your thing, and it would have been, building, alignment, whatever that would be, right? This swag was great. You co-created it, but there's 20 things that would have worked. But what worked is the cohesion you got around it by repeating it and putting on bracelets and talking about it all the time. I was just at an event at a big tech company, and they did a similar thing where they had groups of like 10 people that worked together a lot, sort of come up with their corny mantras. And one of them, the corny mantra was do epic shit. That was it, right? Totally stupid. Totally awesome. Like they all knew what that meant. They all knew what that felt like. It evoked a voice and a personality and a set of stories that they could then refer to. And then they're working on their project and they're thinking, is this epic or is this non-epic? Like it gives you a lens to assess with and then to navigate with and to connect. So those sorts of corny things, they seem so corny, but they're actually genius and they're actually necessary. And they're actually kind of a tell of a good culture. Like you guys have been in some cool locker rooms. You can tell when you're in a place that's got it, and you tend to hear some corny language. And when you first hear it, it kind of seems stupid. And then you don't realize how powerful it is. It actually is a huge tell when you start hearing that stuff over and over again, that, oh, wait, these guys are all on the same page. They're saying the same words. Language is super powerful, and it's really cool to tune into maybe it's just me being a word geek, but it's really cool to tune in the specific power of the right word at the right moment when it's shared by a group.
There are a lot of, you talked about a tech company and doing that makes me think of, I know Amazon at some point, maybe they still do now, has had doors as desks with the idea of like we create value for our customers, not ourselves. A16Z, the venture capital firm, has a rule that's like $10 fine for every minute you're late to meet with entrepreneurs because they're there to serve them. And it's like, so they'll literally schedule 28-minute meetings. So you have a 2 to 5 minute bathroom break in between meetings. And it's like, those guys are loaded, but it's the symbol of that. At the same time, there are a couple shows I watched recently that I've heard you talked about. Super Pumped. We Crash was out recently and talked about like elevating consciousness. What are your thoughts on these like organizations that have like a very well-defined culture, like Uber, which is like win at all cost, but like it's designed in a way that was serving Travis Kalanick's wishes, but was like ungodly unhealthy?
Right. Yeah, you can have a health rating with all that stuff, and you can look at any win at all cost culture, and it is just not a sustainable thing. Whether it's the U.S. Postal Cycling Team in the Lance in the early 2000s, like over and over again, we see that same old story where it's like, if your culture really, if you have a war room, it's probably not a great sign. It might not be a great sign if you're going to war all the time. Maybe you'll win some, and you probably will. Like you'll probably win some. But what is your real goal? Is your goal to win this year? Or is your goal to create an established, sustained, increase your sustained odds of winning year after year, and to continue to attract great people who want to be a part of something? People don't necessarily want to be a part of a war all the time, or a take no prisoners kind of approach. And so that's where I think you see, and we've seen the same story. You referenced a bunch of them just now, right? Kalanick, Elizabeth Holmes. We're in kind of an interesting place with Elon Musk worship right now. Like,
I'll throw Robin Hood in there.
Yeah, right. How many of these? How many times, or WeWork? How many times can we relearn this lesson that if there's one person who says, I alone have the answer, I alone have the knowledge, I alone have the power, like the odds of that being true are vanishingly small. Like everyone's dealing with complex problems. And the thing we know about complex problems is that it's really good to have teams on them. A team will beat an individual every time. And so this idea that there are these, every time we see these lone saviors crash to earth, it is just an inevitability. Like, of course they do, because one person cannot have all the answer. So the question to us is, we're dealing with complicated, complex problems, fast moving change. How do we do that? Well, the way to do that is to build a great team. And when you have a great team, you have people who want to be a part of that team and who enjoy the experience of being on that team. That's why these deeper, I would say more positively oriented, sustainable cultures end up surviving and thriving in the long run. Because they're functioning, the metaphor I go back to over and over again is that succeeding today is like trying to be a flock of birds flying at high speed through a forest. You got to stay together. So you got to be connected. You got to have that safety. You've got to be sharing information transparently all the time so everybody can have agency and can learn and adapt. Oh, there's a tree. We all have to go around the tree. There's a rock. We all have to go around the rock. There's a mountain. Let's all fly toward the mountain. The idea that one bird could be calling out signals to the whole flock saying, turn 4 degrees here, speed up a little here, slow down a little here. That used to work in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s. That sort of top down, just do what you're told approach to culture. But we don't live there anymore. Whether it's sports, whether it's business, whether it's tech, whether it's education, we live in this fast moving forest where we need to have places that are equipped and energized and capable of adapting and staying connected at the same time and moving toward a goal. And so that's why, on a real super functional level, these kind of win at all costs, savior oriented places are going to fail in the long run. And that's why these sort of sustained teams are going to have more success.
How do you build that sustained team? I mean, obviously you've worked around professional sports. And so the owner, the GM, and the head coach, like each of those they're going to have different pull when it comes to setting the tone for the culture. And they don't always have aligning goals. What are some of the tactics or best approaches to get those groups in alignment so it is a tight flock of birds flying through the forest and they're not just kind of all over the place?
I guess the biggest tool is just that one word, relationship. The places that do it well, there is a deep relationship between those principles and they're aligned. And a lot of times, as you say, there are structural forces that are pushing them out of alignment. The owner wants to cash in and sell, or the owner is worried about expenses. And and the GM is worried about his performance on the field. So that's easy to get that out of alignment. And so some of the places that have done it really well, I think, over time have tended to have more hands-off owners than hands-on, right? More hands-off, and have had GMs that are really exceptional at creating deep relationships in the front office and with the coaching staff. I put like the Cleveland Guardians are at the top of the list. I do some work with them, and I'm consistently impressed. The owner is not super hands-on, and that gives people the autonomy and agency and freedom to make good decisions. And in the front office, there's been some people come to visit and they'll watch everyone interact and they'll scratch their heads because they can't tell who's in charge. Like, you literally can't tell if you're in the room with a discussion going on, and there are very vibrant discussions. You can't tell who the powerful people are because they're not acting like powerful people. Those sorts of behaviors, I think end up making it work in the long run. I think if you looked at sort of like, think of the really super sustained success stories in sports, like there aren't that many. St. Louis Cardinals have had kind of sustained success. I'd say the Guardians have had sustained success. I don't know, who else would you think of here? Patriots, obviously.
Patriots, Steelers, Spurs.
Yeah, there aren't that many.
No.
And in each of these, with the exception of Bob Kraft, but Bob, you can't name any of the owners. Like who owns them? They're not Jerry Jones, right? They're not the super, kind of spotlight focused, spotlight hungry person. So that's not a coincidence either. This more relational, low key approach, I would say, is more aligned with creating a great team.
So when hiring for teams, talking a little about culture contribution over culture fit, unpack that idea a little for us.
Yeah, no, it's kind of cool. This idea of culture fit, like we say it all the time, and we say it like it is a great thing, right? Why did we hire them? They were a great culture fit. Why didn't we hire that person? Well, they weren't that great of a culture fit. And it's very tempting to sort of think in those terms, but when you actually go one level deeper, it's unproductive, because when you hire for culture fit, you're creating a monoculture. And there's no culture on earth as dumb and as stubborn and as slow to adapt as a monoculture. They'll get some stuff right, but they'll miss a lot. And it's getting more and more expensive to miss a lot. Having hiring instead of fit, think about contribution. What voices aren't we hearing? Who do we need to hear from? It's funny, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal today about the San Francisco Giants coaching staff and what a diverse group it is. One of the first women in the majors. They've got a guy who's got his PhD in something or other, somebody else who's published poetry, and they've all obviously got baseball experience, but they're really putting and Gabe Kapler is very explicit about this idea that the more diverse voices we have, the harder problems we can solve. And so that idea of I think it's a really important idea, not just in sport, but everywhere, just asking who do we need to hear from here? Who are we not hearing from? And that allows your culture to just build what do you want? You want a big, smart group brain. And big, smart group brains have ideas coming from a lot of different places.
When I interviewed Vikram Mancharamani a couple years ago, he was talking about the idea that we used to be in a society of a bunch of well-rounded people, and now we're a well-rounded society with very narrow expertise and spiky individuals based on their talents. What are your thoughts on whether, if somebody's 25 years old, 30 years old, 35 years old, should they be trying to be that expert? So someone hires Colby Donovan because he can contribute picking up the garbage on Saturday because that's probably all I got? Or is it you really should keep trying to generalize and take the David Epstein approach to being a generalist to offer advice later on?
It's a great question. I'd say the answer probably depends on the context in which you are operating. I mean, what gets somebody, it depends. So I'm going to be sort of general, but what gets someone sort of to move quickly through a structure is that they are providing real value. And value doesn't need to come from some spiky expertise. If you look at the speed with which spiky expertise is getting like automated really, really quickly, it would be pretty discouraging. If you can spend years and years learning how to read x-rays, and then an AI can come along and do it better than you can. So it seems like in this era of automation and artificial intelligence that we're living in, the real specialties end up being much more in the Dave Epstein area, where it's like, what worlds can I connect to create value? Right now, there's a tremendous value opportunity in sports in being the bridge between analytics and the field. Is there someone who can translate really applicable numbers and data analysis to players, to a 17-year-old from the Dominican Republic, and help them put it into action? Like, are there people who can create visuals that can help them do that? Most of the interesting stuff happens when somebody has got a foot planted in a couple different worlds. And so that means that rather than just focus on developing one narrow expertise, it is better to continually experiment and continually try to make syntheses of your world to say, oh, wait, where's the need? How can I answer that need? Where's the need? I guess the question I'd be asking myself if I were a young coach was like, what's going to be the most valuable thing in the next 3 to 5 years? Like, what's going to be the most valuable skill set that teams are going to be craving in the next 3 to 5 years? What domains does that involve? And then I would start exploring in those domains. And then I would try to find some models of people that do it well and go to school on them. And then I would start to do Dave Epstein talks about keeping a book of experiments, where you kind of do these little tests and try things out and build things and connect to people and be entrepreneurial with your learning. It's like, we're not in an era where you can kind of lean back and let it come to you. That it was sort of kind of our parents' era, I think, where it's like, hey, if you get in the right classroom and just take notes, you're going to be fine. That doesn't exist anymore. I think it's really about being entrepreneurial and identifying those places where you can have an impact, and then building the skill set through action, not through reading about it, not through reading about what it would be like. Maybe you can do some reading, obviously, but
read the culture code, obviously
over and over again, but actually doing stuff, just actually doing stuff. There were, it's funny. I'm sort of exposed to the Guardians front office, and there's a lot of people in there who sort of like right before they got hired, they did stuff. They started. One of them built a little video program where they could scout players in the Cape Cod League one year, and he had to sort of build it from the ground up and share it with. And you look at that and you say, wow, that's quite a thing. Maybe it's not perfect. It's not the best, but for somebody who's in their 20s and they actually figured that out and did the business side and did the networking side and did the software side, and they learned a ton. It really demonstrates it's a way to bring those sort of big questions to life and really test them.
So you've mentioned a few times working with the Guardians. I forgive you for not doing it with the Yankees. I'll just chop it up to you're in Cleveland. But what has it been like for you to spend time with them, not in just an observatory way, which I know you've spent a lot of time talking and working with the teams and organizations you observed when you're writing both books, but what's it been like for you to actually be hired and in the trenches with that group?
Yeah, totally a privilege. They're extraordinary people and leaders, and I've learned a ton. So like all good relationships, there's a flow both directions. And as a writer, I spend a lot of time by myself. And so it's a great gift every Thursday afternoon to drive 15 minutes and go be in an office now, not on a Zoom call, but an actual place or even better, watching a game and talking about what people are reading and what they're listening to and what other organizations are doing. And it's just kind of a lovely dose of friendship and fun and exploration that I've come to really enjoy and appreciate. So it keeps my feet on the ground, I guess. As a writer, the danger is you can float off and get lost in abstractions and ideas and concepts. And with a relationship like this in the real world, it continually reminds me this has to work with real people in a real place who are trying to do a real thing. And I found that to be really a healthy sort of dose of reality.
When you visit organizations, all the ones you talk about in both of these books we've talked about, what is your like process to try to learn what's going on there? And how long are you spending, I'm sure it varies, but roughly like with each organization?
Like the process is similar to, this is the wrong metaphor, but I've heard it described as like you circle them, and shark would be the term that comes to mind when you talk about but you circle from the outside in, right? So a big circle is I read everything I can, first of all, about what it's like, the best sources you can find, the most detail you can find, and then you move a little bit closer and you start talking to people, right? And doing interviews with people who have been there and who have a lot to say about it that you pulled from your readings. And then when you get there, usually it's about like 3 days that you would hopefully spend there, where by the time you get there, you hopefully know what's the most interesting stuff and who are the most interesting people that you want to spend time with. Because that will also go sideways. Once you're there, you'll discover all kinds of new interesting stuff, and the assumptions you had maybe weren't right. And so new stuff will open up. So it ends up, and then you might have a few follow-ups afterwards. So it's this conversational sort of rhythm where you send a few probes out there and then get some information back and adjust what you think and go back in again and then adjust what you think and explore the interesting, crazy stuff that gets uncovered. Keeping your mind open to notice weird stuff ends up being a really important thing. There was a time, I think I was visiting you guys, and somebody spilled something on the floor in Florida, and I saw Billy Donovan take a towel and clean it up. And I remember thinking, like, that's weird, and then I subsequently to that saw a couple of other coaches do that too. And it actually, turned into a tip that I have in the book, because so many leaders, actually that ends up being this really cool signal that leaders use to sort of demonstrate and embody the selfless attitude that they want to create. So every coach sees their player wiping that up and they're thinking, well, I should do more too. Even, and the one I didn't include in the book was when Tim Duncan came back to the Spurs and assistant coach. They were doing workouts and one of the players puked, and Tim Duncan wiped up the rookie's puke on the court. It's like, come on, Hall of Famer, like, talk about culture. I think that might be the ultimate gold standard of service.
Yikes. Yeah, I got a bone to pick with you because, as a manager, that was my job to clean that up. So it's like you're publicly shaming me in a best-selling book that I sucked at my job one day. So, but I'll give you a pass. When you think back on all the organizations you visited, what is there like first thing that comes to your head, like moment that stands out that just blew you away?
Gosh, one thing that surprised me, I guess, and I know I've talked about the Guardians a couple of times here, was early on when I was working with them, one of their assistant coaches got interviewed for a major league job. And I found out later that the president and the GM spent like 3 or 4 hours preparing that coach for his interview, mock interviewing him, getting him working on his book. And I guess that continues to kind of blow me away. Like, you sort of think, well, if somebody gets a job, you'd sort of congratulate them and wish them well. But what you find is that in great cultures, the opposite happens. You actually have this incredible moment of support, of happiness, of joy, but of also of like deep support and care that, hey, we don't want, we want you to do what's best for you in the long run. We're bummed you're leaving. But wow, let's tell you what kind of tie looks best and give you a great suit and give you a great notebook, and send you and support you on your way. And it turns out Bill Walsh, 49ers legendary coach, did exactly the same thing. He gave his departing assistants, and in these great cultures, as you know, the assistants just get poached over and over again, right? Like they get taken away every year. He would give his assistants the playbook. He'd give it to them. Now, in most places, that playbook would be intellectual property. Like, oh, playbook, we got to guard that with our lives. It's the playbook. But what Walsh knew, what good leaders know, is that the playbook is useless without the supporting culture, without all the infrastructure and sinew and muscle and brain of all those people together. So he'd say, yeah, you can have the plays we run, and he's like, here's your toolkit for your new job. That's what he would say to his assistants. So I guess those stories continue to blow me away. I don't know that I could be that generous if I were them. And it shows how deep, I think, how deeply serious great cultures are about caring. Like the caring, we hear that word all the time, caring, but that's not just a word in those places. That is a deeply rooted behavior, and they're always looking for an opportunity to show it.
So going back over the experiences, all your research that you've done back to Talent Code coming out in 2009, is there anything that you've experienced where you feel like, my feelings have kind of changed on that, or maybe I just look at that differently now than I did 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah, there was a time where I was kind of all in, and this is getting a little esoteric, but I was all in on like the power of really slow-mo practice to let you show you where you made mistakes. And there was a lot of examples of that I saw in the Talent Code, some in the music world, some in the tennis world, some in the golf world. And I've since realized, like, what I've learned more and more about motor learning, I don't think that I should have been quite as all in on that. That's one area that I just sort of off the top of my head, I would say that super slow-mo thing. I don't know if the science is as in on that as I thought it was. And beyond that, though, I don't really go back and look or think about those other books that much. And I don't know if that's a terrible thing, if I should be circling on about them. But I find myself just kind of too, immersed in now or thinking about the next thing to push rewind.
Well, that's my next question. So we're talking on May 3rd, book release today, everyone. Check the link in the show notes. Go order it on Amazon. What's next?
I don't know, something sort of about well-being. I think there's something around this idea of what it means to have a fulfilling, flourishing, thriving life, and what's that made of. And I'm kind of exploring in that territory a little bit, because it's sort of, there's a lot of, we've typically answered that question by saying, well, you want to be successful, right? And I think we've realized as a society, even in the last couple of years, like it's not all that, right? How do we really want to define success? How do we, you look at people who made it to the top of their individual sports and you or individual quests, and you can find a group of pretty unhappy, dysfunctional people many times. And so I guess I want to take a kind of a broader, softer lens to that whole project, kind of the larger human project of what it means to live a good life.
Sounds like an easy one to figure out and write about. Not a big deal. Glad you're focused on easy topics. Last question before we wrap. Any other documentaries, shows? I mean, we talked about like Super Pumped and Elizabeth Holmes, but not necessarily business, but books related to this or like completely off the wall that you've just like been fascinated by in the last year or so?
Yeah, a few good ones. There's one called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. It's kind of a bizarre, neat book, kind of about sensing your path. I think that's really great. There's a book called Bittersweet by Susan Cain that is kind of about the power of sadness, which is a really interesting, cool thing. And finally, there's a book called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman, which is, it's a number of weeks you get in your life. And so these are all kind of existential books, but the idea of how powerful limits can be when you kind of embrace them and see them clearly. It's a great read.
I don't know if you listened to Tim Ferriss had on Boyd Vardy, who wrote the book. What is it? The Lion's Tracker's Guide to Life. It was phenomenal.
No way.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So there you go. There's your 3 hours of homework. Well, I appreciate you joining us today. This has been a blast. I'm sure we'll be on the bestseller list soon. And listeners, the Culture Playbook, 60 highly effective actions to help your group succeed. Mr. Coyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Totally enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Colby. Thanks, Oliver.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Coaching Coaches Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and receive our world-class newsletter in your inbox every Sunday. You can access both of those at coachingcoaches.co. Once again, that's coachingcoaches.co.